All right, good evening, everyone. As we begin tonight's program, we acknowledge that King's University College is located in close proximity to three vibrant local First Nations communities who have long-standing relationships with the land and place that we now recognize as London, Ontario. Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. Historically, the Attawaddaron peoples also once settled this region alongside Algonquin and the Haudenosaunee peoples and used this land as their traditional beaver hunting grounds. Today, a diverse and growing Indigenous population live in London and the surrounding areas. Now, many here this evening will not be Indigenous, but we are all treaty people, along with all of the responsibilities and the duties that entails. So each of us is called and must constantly work to advocate for the freedom of all people to join in the stewardship of this land and care for each other. So my name is Jim Pancho. I'm the Director of Campus Ministry here at King's and have been coordinator of the Veritas lecture series for a few years now. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. This is the last of our Veritas lectures for this year. It's a little bit bittersweet, but this series this year has been called A Still Small Voice. And those who are scripture familiar in the world will recognize it. But our goal this year has been to be able to listen for those moments when we perceive truth and the presence of something greater that unites us rather than divides us. And so all of our speakers this year have spoken to that in some way. And in a polarized world, the loudest voices are not always the most truthful voices, and we want to hear the truthful voices. So often it's in times that we now experience some of the most challenging times that a simple, truthful voice can indeed emerge. Which brings us to tonight's speaker. So Father John Meehan is a Jesuit and a doctor from, who's a Canadian Jesuit. Sorry, I'm off scripting too much. But Dr. John Meehan is with us this evening. He's a Canadian Jesuit who has served as president of Campion College in Regina and the University of Sudbury. He's a graduate of McGill, Oxford, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Toronto. And he's taught and published on Canadian foreign relations, Jesuit history, and relations with Indigenous peoples. He is active in reconciliation work, and he's going to speak about some of that tonight. And especially with Indigenous communities, and most recently, he attended the Papal Apology to Residential School Survivors at Massachusetts, Alberta. As part of his Jesuit training, he has worked with gang kids in Mississippi, immigrants, prison inmates, and people with disabilities. And he's currently the director of the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History at Trinity College at the University of Toronto. So I think he is well qualified to speak to us this evening, and I'm delighted that he agreed to come. I consider him a friend, as many of you who here also do, and I'm delighted that you're all here to hear this talk. Please join me in welcoming John Meehan.
Yep, I think I'll just use the cordless to... Okay, can people hear me okay? Good, good. Well, good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here, and I know Jim and I have been talking about this for a while, so thank you to Jim for your invitation. I know last summer I did a workshop with his campus ministry group in Guelph, which was a lot of fun. And of course, David Malloy, thank you also. And David and I worked together in Regina, where I spent 10 very happy years. And I know others here, Rob Ventresca, from different chapters of my life. So as I look out, it's kind of interesting to be reminded of that, and lots of people I don't know. So it's wonderful to meet you all, and the people who are watching virtually as well. So here we are tonight, and it's been an honor to be part of this series on listening. And I did watch some of the other lectures, especially Chief Cadmus Delorme, if you heard him. And I know Cadmus from my time in Regina as well. Just over the refreshments, I was telling people, I'm originally from Nova Scotia, and I joined the Jesuits later in life after a doctorate in history at U of T. And that doctorate, as Jim just said, was on Canada's relations with Asia. I've published on relations with Japan and with China. And so when the Jesuits asked where I wanted to work, of course, I said, I'm very interested in working in China. And they sent me to Regina. And that's the Jesuit vow of obedience for you. And I asked for China 4 times, and I got sent to Regina 4 times. And they're nothing at all alike. And what I discovered in that experience, and maybe I'm something for the vow of obedience, is looking back now, was one of the best assignments I've had. It was the assignment where I felt I really was making a difference. Why? Because I realized there's a whole culture or cultures in our midst as Canadians that I, with a PhD in Canadian history, knew nothing about. I did that in the 90s. We learned next to nothing about residential schools, and certainly nothing about the Cree culture, Lakota culture. And it was basically through relationships of showing up at Indigenous events, powwows. David and I have the privilege of being on the same campus as First Nations University of Canada, meeting people like Cadmus, who back then were students, up-and-coming leaders. And I learned a lot about leadership from Indigenous peoples, different model of leadership. We talked earlier about servant leadership at the reception. And I think those experiences really changed the way I look at many things, at what it means to be Canadian, what it means to be Catholic, to be part of a church that has had this, an order, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, that have over 400-year history with Indigenous peoples. There has been light, there's been darkness, shadows. And as Canadians, and for those who are Christian or Catholic, or if you're not, it's part of our history, and it's something that we have to own. So tonight, I'm not speaking for the Jesuits, I'm speaking as John Meehan. And I hope you hear my comments as somebody who has been an administrator, been an educator, also a Jesuit priest, also a Canadian, who thinks about these issues and has been shaped by them. So it's an honor to be in the same series as Cadmus and the other speakers. And I like the theme of listening. And let's see if we can change this. There's a great fire. God's not in the fire either. And finally, he hears a still small breeze. Some translations have sheer silence, and that's where he hears God. So tonight we're going to talk about listening, but listening in the context of higher education. We're talking about higher education, Catholic education, but also the humanities. And for me, all of these things are very closely linked. So listening. Listening is not easy in our age of busyness and distraction. We have a lack of time to reflect, to discern. We think of the impact of technology. That's another thing we chatted about earlier on, just before this talk, and how technology has impacted our ability to listen to people. So I'll just want to start with a story. I like stories. And a few years ago, I was in Montreal for a short stint as I was teaching at McGill and also interim director of the Newman Center, which is the Catholic chaplaincy at McGill. And one of the outings we had for the students was to go to see a monastery. They had never been to a monastery before. So I took them to a Benedictine monastery just south of Montreal. Maybe some of you have been there, called Saint Benoit du Lac. I don't know if has anyone been to them. Yeah. And they thought this would be neat to go and see a monastery. So we organized it, and I know a couple of the monks, and it was a beautiful fall day. And on the drive, it's about 2 hours or less, one of the students in my car said, we're driving, and she said, I'm interested in going to this monastery, but I feel so sorry for those monks. And I said, why? And she goes, well, they must be so isolated and disconnected. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they live in the monastery. They make a vow never to leave. They don't know what's going on in the world. They live there and they die there and then they're forgotten. What a sad life. They must be so disconnected. I didn't say anything. And then we went to a mass and we stayed for lunch with the monks. And then after lunch, they eat very well, these monks, by the way. Maybe that helped. And then we did a Q&A session with two of the monks all afternoon. It was only supposed to last an hour. It lasted the entire afternoon. And I was quite interested too, because the students asked great questions. The monks gave very honest answers. And the way they interacted with each other, with a sense of humor, with affection for each other, with a deep knowledge of what's going on in the world. Because they pray for the world. They follow these things. They knew exactly what was going on in the world. When we returned back to Montreal, that same student was in my car and she said, you know what, Father John, I was so wrong about those monks. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, they're not isolated at all. She said, they know exactly what's going on in the world. She said, I realized I'm the one who's disconnected. And she said, even with our gadgets, I think I'm so connected to everything because I have so much knowledge at my fingertips. But she said, those monks are connected to the things that matter, to nature, to creation, to God, to silence, to friendship. And her comment to me really made me think about what we do in higher education, of how we are called to form the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, and how we can miss these things sometimes through burying ourselves in technology. The technology that is supposed to connect us can often lead us isolated in other ways. So that was an interesting story for me, as I learned so much from the students. Right here. And that brings me to tonight's topic. I'm going to talk about listening in the context of Catholic higher education, but also when we talk about the future of Catholic higher education, which is not clear, I think it's also linked to the future of humanities and the liberal arts, which is also not clear in our present age. Now, some might think this is an outdated topic because really there are only two medieval institutions left, the church and the university. Both go back centuries, both have their traditions and pageantry, and as we know, both are fairly resistant to change. And yet both are under incredible pressure to change in the current climate. With regard to the humanities, and earlier people were asking about my experience in Regina and later at Laurentian. Of course, I don't really need to get into Laurentian because you've all read the headlines. The financial pressure on universities today in this country is enormous. And so there's an incredible pressure to make money, of course, to cover expenses, to grow. And yet COVID has been a sobering call for us all, hasn't it? With the impact that's had on universities that have relied excessively on international students. We have some universities in this country that have over half their students are international. And that's had a huge impact during COVID when those students could no longer be here. Budgetary pressures, emphasis on cost cutting, revenue generation, getting government funding, having active development offices, international recruiting. But the bigger question of the relevance, how are the liberal arts relevant? Will my child be able to get a degree? What's it good for? If university is in the knowledge market, well, we have the internet now for knowledge. So is that the only purpose of university? It seems to me that the university and the church, as two medieval institutions, are both in the midst of an identity crisis. What is their function in society? What is their value? What is their relevance? These are very topical questions. And do they have a future? So although I'm going to talk about Catholic higher education, really it's in this context of the liberal arts and the humanities. Now, I often use this image here for my Jesuit history course, which is really history of the modern world. We have on the left the Gothic Cathedral, Middle Ages, which instantly draws your eyes upward. Because God is up there, we're down here, we're insignificant. That was kind of the Gothic period. But on our right, of course, we have humanism. Man, human beings as the measure of all things. As the great Roman classicist Terence said, nothing human is foreign to me. And so we have that great period of Renaissance humanism from that had such a big impact on universities. Universities which were started by the church back in the 1200s, but that came to embrace this humanism. Humanism which had an optimistic view of human nature and human potential. Humanism which emphasized the classics of what it means to be a good citizen, an engaged citizen, what it means to be an educated person, mind, body, and spirit. That schools, universities are there for formation. That they deal with not clients and customers, but real living human beings with minds, bodies, and souls. The Renaissance humanism that valued things like friendship. Friendship as a way of engaging the other. Contemplation. And the idea of a Renaissance man or Renaissance woman, a person well-formed in a variety of disciplines who's able to make connections between them and be engaged in their society to make a difference. I think what we're at in this stage of history in university is a radical change in that centuries-old tradition. The future of the Catholic university, even more under question. Here's a picture of Georgetown. I didn't study there, but I did live in DC. I went to the competition. This is my pre-Jesuit days. I did my master's in international relations there. Georgetown, kind of seen as the flagship Jesuit school in the US, founded in 1789. There are 28 Jesuit universities in the US and dozens, or a couple hundred, few hundred actually, Catholic colleges and universities in the United States. Incredible network. Globally, 200 Jesuit universities, post-secondary institutions. It's the largest and oldest post-secondary network in the world. And as I said earlier, the church that founded universities. But today, that association with the church has become problematic for many. We only have to think of the abuse scandals that have rocked the church's role in residential schools, the shift to secular society, where Catholic identity and mission for many institutions has now become awkward, embarrassing, a liability, and even harmful to the future of the institution. So in a distracted, polarized world that's increasingly secular, relativistic, with ideological divides, what role does the Catholic intellectual tradition have anymore? These are questions that all Catholic institutions face. And tonight, when I talk about Catholic higher ed, there are different models. I'm not really talking about the Steubenville model, which would be a model for primarily Catholics. I'm thinking more of the Catholic Liberal Arts College, places like King's, Campion. There are about 23 or 4 in Canada and many others in the United States. The importance of identity and mission, I think, is central here. How are the universities and the church responding to this new change in the context? There's a paradigm shift going on. And working in the world of higher education, the whole sector is being rocked by the changes to the liberal arts, emphasis on STEM. There are liberal arts colleges south of the border that are doing well, but it's a struggle for those of us who work in the liberal arts to have a sustainable approach to that, an approach that students will identify with. The church is entering a new paradigm, and I think Pope Francis is a big part of it. Pope Francis is trying to present a church that is not only relevant, but that is speaking to the margins, of bringing those in the margins to the center, to offer hope. His image of the church is a field hospital, a church based not on privilege, but on justice, on the poor and marginalized. So I'm very impressed by this Pope and the example that he gives kind of servant leadership. So when we place these medieval institutions in the modern context, I think a really helpful guide in all this is Charles Taylor, because he's looked a lot at modernity and at secularism, the two forces that are shaping Catholic higher education today. And his two seminal works, The Malaise of Modernity and A Secular Age, he actually taught me at McGill. I had him as a professor. I don't know if anyone else had Charles Taylor as a professor. Most of what he said went over our heads. And my one critique of his writing is he could use a good editor. These are very weighty tomes, and he's got great points, but they cut, I hope anyway, to simplify them for you in one slide tonight. But a lot of his ideas will work through my presentation. He analyzes modernity, and he looks at the critiques of modernity. But he has a nuanced version of modernity. He doesn't say modernity is bad. He says, he looks at the role of individualism. We live in a very individualistic age, relativistic, fragmented as well, instrumentalist. And we can see how that's affected both the university and the church. So instrumentalism meaning efficiency stressed, results, deliverables, measurables. Any board members here? This is how we've, instrumentalizing education itself. What, can I get a job with that degree? Or will I be serving fries for the rest of my life with this degree? Alienation, powerlessness, the sense that you're not going to make a difference in these huge impersonal structures anymore. But he also sees in modernity a search for self-fulfillment and authenticity, and that he sees this as a good thing, that nowadays the modern search is looking for the real and the authentic. Now, sometimes the search for authenticity can get a little bit twisted, because sometimes people will vote for politicians who they think are very authentic, and we might think are very dangerous. But I think he might say that this is, in a way, taps into the search for authenticity. In the secular age, he looks through history to say how we've gone from an enchanted world where everyone believed in God. Nobody would question that. It's funny, I live with a few Haitians in my house. I've got 7 Haitians in my community. I live with 40 young Jesuits. And my Haitian friends tell me that in Haiti, they don't know anyone who does not believe in God. In Haiti, to say you don't believe in God would be surprising. Like it's unheard of. But of course, in the Enchanted Age, you also believed in witches and fairies and other things. After the Enlightenment, etc., now we're in a disenchanted age, and of enlightenment, where many people don't believe in those things. It's quite possible to live your life without believing in any higher power or anything supernatural. Lots of people do. But he says also that what went along with that was no heroes anymore, no dreams anymore, that there's been a leveling of life. And he said what we're lacking now is depth and fullness. So there's kind of a flatness that's come into the modern world, where, for those of you who remember Peggy Lee from the 60s, is this all there is? And so Charles Taylor looks at this, is this all there is in the modern age? And there's also this dissatisfaction that, I suppose, from the whole spiritual dimension of what it means to be human, can often be lost in a secular environment, which really privatizes religion. So in a secular space, usually religion is not something we talk about, especially as Canadians. That's a private matter. We don't. What if we disagree? Or are you trying to convert me? Or if we're going to have a talk between two people of different faiths, one's going to win, one's going to lose. So how do we have these conversations? Anyway, he concludes that in any case, we're at the beginning of a new age of religious searching whose outcome no one can foresee. So I think Taylor frames it very interestingly for us. in both of these works. And I encourage you, if you haven't read any Taylor, but I'm sure many of you had, that this is something that will be very helpful as we navigate our way forward. To go back to our theme of listening, listening, I love that you've chosen this for your series. There we have Elijah up in the cave. He's listening to the still small voice. I'm at the bottom. I'm not comparing myself to Elijah here in these pictures, but the fellow I'm listening to here is a knowledge keeper, Noel Starr Blanket, who David will remember from the University of Regina. He passed away a few years ago. He was the elder on campus in Regina, and somebody who earned a lot of respect from people, someone who taught me a lot about reconciliation. The first time I met Noel, he had gone to Lebret Residential School, a Catholic residential school outside of Regina. And like many people who went to that school told me, when he got out of the school, he was filled with a lot of anger because of what he experienced in the school. And had a real hatred, he said, for religion. Particularly Catholics, priests, just because of what he experienced in the school. And yet we've developed a friendship between us over the, let's see, about 4 or 5 years, I guess, until he passed away, in which we were able to build that trust between us and to help bring our communities together. So I was president of Campion College, which is the Catholic college in Regina. He was the elder on campus. And we went to ceremony together. We prayed together. We talked to students together. And that was something that was very meaningful to me, and that changed me as a person. He invited me to Sundance, which is the most sacred lodge for the Cree. That one you do have to be invited to. And I remember going to that, and a woman came up to me and she said, Noel would always introduce me as his friend, Dr. Meehan. He didn't say father very often. He said, this is my friend, Dr. John Meehan. I remember a Cree woman came up to me and she said, is it true you're a priest? And I said, yes, why? And she said, you don't know how much your being here is helping my healing. And I walked away and I asked Noel, what did she mean by that? And he said, well, think about it. You represent a culture, a church that for a long time said that our culture is no good. Our languages are no good. Our spiritualities are no good. We're no good. But by you being here, you're showing that you don't believe that. And that's the day that I realized that for those in the room who are Catholic, our presence means the healing has to occur on both sides for reconciliation. If you're invited, show up and keep showing up, and you'll be invited to other things. It's a very important to be there and to listen. And listening is not easy. Listening is challenging. It requires certain skills. It requires a non-judgmental attitude. It requires time. Whenever I would go to the reserve to either to do a mass or to go to a traditional Indigenous ceremony, I'd often take off my watch. As some of the Indigenous elders told me, you may have the watches, but we've got the time. And the time meant it was so different. And they gave me a new appreciation for time. So the listening that went on was challenging. And as I like to tell non-Indigenous, including Catholics, if you want to walk with Indigenous people and you had the benefit of hearing Cadmus Delorme, you have to be willing to be with people in their pain and anger, particularly at the church. And that's not easy. I remember this session here we did on TRC in the church. And as I went in, there was one very older Catholic man, quite devout Catholic. And he said, I wasn't wearing my collar there. He said, Father, I hope you defend the church tonight. And I thought, well, that's not the purpose of this event. The purpose of this event is to listen to what the Indigenous have to tell us. And when this paper appeared in the Regina Leader Post the next day, one of the Jesuits in my house, he's quite funny, he said, I like that picture. And I said, why? He said, because the indigenous leader is speaking and the priest is listening. And makes me think. I think what Pope Francis is trying to offer, especially in the synodality approach that's going on in the church now, is a church that listens. Can we become an organization where we listen to each other? And I think that's true of a Catholic college as well, and of any university. Can we set up structures that are less hierarchical and more in tune with listening to the other and what the other has to teach us? We need certain listening skills to focus on the other person, to pay attention to what they're saying, to avoid judgment, to avoid interrupting, to respect silence when it occurs, to reflect, to share, to clarify. And we know from when we truly feel listened to, and it's not very often actually, there are very few good listeners. Think about somebody in your life who's a good listener. Hopefully your spouse, and hopefully you when we listen to somebody, a lot of my day is spent listening to people, students, who have nobody to listen to them. And it's an incredibly empowering thing to be listened to and heard. And anyway, I think we've all had that experience. It's one of the best ways we can help others. It's transformative. I think that a listening stance can transform both the church and the university. It's countercultural in a context of sound bites, tweets, and social media echo chambers. And of course, we know that listening is not an end in itself, but it leads to service and healing, our own healing and that of others. As Jesuits, we've been doing a lot of discernment in common. I don't know if you've seen this in many of our organizations now, and not just Jesuits, many others. An approach that was borrowed from Belgium, ESDAC. I think that's Exercice Spirituel de Discernement Apostolique Communautaire. And so typically we kind of sit in a sharing circle. And when I was up in Sudbury, I did this with the Indigenous. They took to it instantly. They passed the feather around. But this was like totally separate development in Belgium where people just share about their life experience. What's going on? What are your consolations, desolations? Where do you find life? Where do you find joy? Where do you find energy? Where do you find the opposite? Your frustrations, your challenges. And each person gets the same amount. They have a method. Each person gets the same amount of time. They listen. They have a second round where you share what moved you and what you heard. This is active listening. Listening to not only the words that are being said, but the sentiment that's underneath those words that says where that person really is. When I was at Campion, I did this with my staff. I did this with my leadership team. And when you go around the circle and somebody says, look, I'm not feeling my best today. I just lost my father last week. It sure helps you work better with that person. You have a lot more patience for that person. This is something we actually brought into our leadership team. And we did this at our board meetings. We did this with our faculty and our staff. And it really did help to bring people together, to create a sense of community, but also to focus on the identity and mission of the college itself. One of the applications of this, of course, is you might have seen this guide, Listening to Indigenous Voices. It was a guide that's put together, that's been used now in many schools across Canada, parishes, church groups, non-religious groups. Actually, there's an example drawn from London. I think chapter 2 is an example from a First Nation just north of you. I don't know if it's north or south, but I know it's downriver from London because raw sewage is being pumped into the Thames and going into that community. I forget the name of the community. It's in chapter 2 of Listening to Indigenous Voices, and I had never heard of that. And so my work now in Toronto on reconciliation is working mainly with non-Indigenous groups to raise awareness of Indigenous issues. Things they never learned in school. So that is, that's some applications. How does this relate to universities? Well, when I reflect on the question of how we can chart a course forward for Catholic higher education, but also for the liberal arts, for universities as a whole, I think listening has to occur on 3 levels. And here I'm really drawing from the Catholic intellectual tradition. The first is a listening to self. So how are students being treated now in universities? Again, I had kind of an extreme case up in Laurentian, but from a lot of international students I talked to, they kind of feel like cash cows. They pay a lot more money in tuition. And that's what happens if we start viewing students as consumers or customers. Again, using kind of a business language. And what I've discovered in my work in Catholic higher education is when the institution loses its sense of identity and mission, the natural default is it becomes more of a business and a job. You lose that sense of kind of a communal identity or purpose. And as in healthcare, it begins to look more and more like a business. Now, some of that's normal. We do have to cover expenses. We do have to generate revenue. But the impact that can have on students, faculty, and staff, it can be severe. And I think I didn't want to get into the Laurentian issue so much specifically tonight, but I think that's an extreme example of where this can go. One of the best articles I read on, well, this is Jesuit higher education, but could apply to Catholic higher education more generally, is a talk given by the Father Adolfo Nicolas, who one of you knows from Japan. You do. Who gave a talk to the 200 Jesuit universities who met in Mexico City in 2010. And I have a copy. It's one of the best things I've read on Catholic higher ed because it shows the value. And what he said in this was, he's, again, as a good Jesuit, reflecting on the signs of the times. And he looked at the impact of technology. And he was asking his professor friends at Sophia in Tokyo, great university in the middle of Tokyo, what are you reading lately? And the professors got all very embarrassed and said, I'm not reading anything. I'm spending most of my time on social media and reading my emails, and I haven't read a good book in years. And Father Nicholas said, gosh, if the professors are saying that, where are the students? What must the students be doing? And if you look at the statistics of how much time we spend online, etc., my phone reminds me of how much time I spend on phone every day. I'm a little embarrassed to look at it. Guilty as charged. But when Adolfo Nicolas reflected on the impact of technology, he said, we are truly global. We know more about the world than our parents did, and far more than our grandparents did. But he said, you can friend and unfriend with the click of a mouse. So he said it's global, but he called it the globalization of superficiality. We're global, but it's not very deep. And I think that's a great phrase, the globalization of superficiality. And he said what we're supposed to be doing in our Jesuit universities and Catholic universities is depth. Giving students depth of thought, depth of analysis, depth of criticism intellectually, but also depth of commitment, depth of compassion, depth of imagination. He talks a lot about the imagination, which was a major feature of the Renaissance humanist tradition. To be able to use your imagination to imagine a better world, to imagine a different way of doing things. And that's something he talks about in the article. It's quite interesting. Know thyself, the famous inscription of the Delphic Oracle. And we want to encourage our students to know themselves. And that's why we encourage the liberal arts. It's through the liberal arts that you get to know yourself, your place in the world. I've always been fascinated by leadership, and to what extent self-knowledge is a very important part of leadership. A good leader is somebody who has a fairly deep sense of themselves in the world, their strengths, their limitations, etc. One of the other features of the humanist tradition is, of course, character and leadership. Education as a way to form the generalist who's able to deal with other people, to understand things from different angles, and to have an impact on their surroundings. That's leadership. And if you think about it, we're all called to be leaders because we all have influence or impact on somebody. It could be your family, it could be your colleagues, but you're all influencers. Even if you don't have thousands of followers, you're still an influencer. That's leadership. And so to take that very seriously. And of course, another feature of this tradition is what was called in Latin cura personalis, care of the person. Again, in the Catholic intellectual tradition, you're called to care for all the students, not just students, but the faculty and staff. They're human beings. They're employees, yes. They're students, yes. Are they customers or clients, or are they human beings that are entrusted, who are being formed mind, body, and spirit? And the formation is not just in the classroom intellectually, it's in the cafeteria. It's in the residence. It's in sports. It's that holistic view of education that is firmly rooted in the Catholic tradition for centuries. Now, maybe it hasn't been emphasized, or maybe we haven't been talking about it much. I personally believe that there's a hunger for this out there, that our students want to be treated as more than, I hope I'm right on this. Do our students, or do they prefer to be treated as clients and customers? You know, I pay my money, you give me the A. It's transactional. That's a utilitarian way of viewing education. I know we've got some students here tonight. Is that what you want? How much money do you have? How much does this A cost? My students love to be treated as human beings who have a mind, a body, a soul, who are in process of shaping the world. I have the privilege of teaching extremely bright, committed students in the International Relations program at U of T. These students, I know, are going to go out and change the world, and they want to. It's a huge task because they look at the world the way it is, and it's easy to lose hope. But somehow these students are doing all kinds of amazing things on campus, on raising awareness around racism, around sexism, around injustice where they see it. And the students inspire me. So keep doing what you're doing. We need you. We need your youth and your enthusiasm and your imagination and your vision and your commitment to make the world a better place. So that care of the person, I think, is very important. Now, I've been talking a lot about Catholic higher education up here, and I'm a Jesuit, and that's what I worked in. But when I was in Regina, what struck me was when I would cross the street to First Nations University of Canada, they were saying something very similar. They had the medicine wheel. They talked about formation of the mind, body, spirit. I would go to their graduation ceremony. And like our students, actually more than our students, most of the students at First Nations were the first in their family to get a university education. Cadmus is being one of many. And at one graduation, I think, David, you probably went to some of these too, the valedictorian would get up and she said, you know, we're not just here to give you knowledge. Indigenous people that I talk to know very clearly what a university is for. There's no confusion about the role of a university, like there is in mainstream Canadian society, where we wonder what's the purpose of university, what's the purpose of liberal arts. They quite clearly say the reason I'm at university is to help my community. Now, I haven't heard too many non-Indigenous students give that answer to me. Usually when I ask them, why are you here? They say, I'm here for a career. I'm here to, which is good. I mean, we all need careers. We all need, but the Indigenous students more than the non-Indigenous would say, I'm here to help my community. We had a support group for people getting out of jail in Saskatchewan, and 80% of them were Indigenous. And he went to university from jail. And when he went to his class, the professor asked him, why are you here? And he said something I've never heard a student say in all my years in university. That student said, I'm here to be a better person. Senator Murray Sinclair from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if you've ever heard him speak, I hope you all have somewhere, maybe he spoke here. He spoke in Regina. When he spoke there, he said, we have to help young people answer 4 basic questions. Where am I from? Where am I going? Who am I? And why am I here? It's about listening to the self. Who am I? And I think the humanities ground us in that. And the Indigenous traditions and Catholic traditions ground us in that. Where are we from? Who are we? Why am I here? What's my purpose? And to have a university that has a safe space where we can engage people on those questions, I think is really, really important. So the more I delve into kind of my own tradition of Catholic and Jesuit higher education, and the more I learn about Indigenous education, the more I see the compatibility and similarities. despite obviously the legacy of residential schools where where the church was part of a colonization process of assimilation. We can talk about that in our questions as well. But I think if we get to the source of both traditions, we see more compatibility than differences. But we can discuss that further in the question time. So that's the first thing. The other thing, the second form of listening, I think that we're all called to do in the university, and including in the Catholic tradition, is listen to others. That our education is not just for ourselves, but as I said earlier, it's to help the community. It's to give back to community. And during our time at university, to be exposed to others, especially others who do not think the way we might, in order to learn from them. In the classical humanist tradition, this was known as the common good, something we don't talk much about anymore. But in those early Jesuit schools, they read Cicero as much as the Bible, probably more than the Bible. Cicero and the classic writers on what does it mean to be an engaged citizen, that you have an impact. We have a responsibility to know what's going on in the world, to be involved and actually do something about it. Father Pedro Rupe was head of the Jesuits in the 70s, 80s, very strong emphasis on social justice. And he gave a famous speech at Valencia in Spain in 1973. And of course, by this point, Jesuit schools in Europe are for the elite. And he said before all these Jesuit alumni, he said, have we educated you for justice in the tradition of Catholic social teaching? He said, quite frankly, we have not. An astounding claim, and many people in the audience walked out on him. They had never heard that before. But this education for justice, a faith that does justice, this was a time in the Catholic Church where they were saying justice is not an add-on to the faith, it's a constituent element of the faith. And so what these Jesuit and other Catholic schools started emphasizing more and more was the tradition of women and men for others and with others. Again, this education is not just for you, it's for society, it's to improve society. And to offer experiences for students, and I know King's is very good at this, of dealing with, especially with the poor and marginalized, of having that integrated into the curriculum through engaged learning and other things. So this idea of engaged global citizens. I've got the example there of the Jesuits and two women who were gunned down in El Salvador at La Uca in 1989, again, for criticizing the injustice of the regime there. I know Pope Francis has been talking a lot about a culture of dialogue and encounter, and I'm really interested in that. Dialogue, creating a space where we can truly dialogue. Dialogue means listening and talking. Listening to the other, engaging them as equals without judging, and learning. An encounter means both parties in the encounter are changed, are transformed through that listening. And as Jim said, I was able to be at Musqueam's First Nation last July when the Pope came and apologized. We can talk about that too. I don't think in all my life I've ever been in such an emotionally charged space as that. To see the head of the Catholic Church come into the powwow grounds at Musqueam's in front of thousands of residential school survivors, some of whom have forgiven the church, some of whom have not, and many of whom are not going to anytime soon. And to hear how he listened and said those words that people have been waiting many years to hear. And of course, they're just words. We're eager to see the actions that follow from them, but very important words nonetheless. As he says below here, if there's one word that we should never tire repeating, it's this: dialogue. To promote a culture of dialogue by every possible means and rebuild the fabric of society. It's a discipline that engages us to view others as valid dialogue partners, to respect the foreigner, the immigrant, people from different cultures as worthy of being listened to. Do we do that in our institutions? Ways of doing this in practice that we've seen, I mentioned here at King's, I know you do this, a very good job of doing this, of taking students to the poor and marginalized, whether that's a country in somewhere else in the hemisphere or on your own doorstep. We did this at Campion. I know Pope Francis likes to talk about head, heart, and hands. I like that image. Just briefly, he talks about with the technology in our pocket, we know more about the world than any generation before us, and it's important for us to know what's going on in the world. But knowledge alone isn't enough. We have to let that go to our hearts to be moved. Just to know what's going on is not enough. We have to be willing, I think he said, to cry again. Because until our hearts are moved, there will be no changes in our world on ecology or anything else until our hearts are changed. And then that's not enough. It has to go to the hands. You actually have to do something. So a good engaged learning program has the information, has the emotional component of encounter, but also has the practical side as well. And one thing we made sure to do at Campion too was the reflection piece, that this is not just ticking a box, but it's actually discussing how this has changed you as a person and what you take forward from this. We did an Indigenous immersion experience for young Jesuits in training. We brought them out to Saskatchewan for 6 weeks. We learned from elders. We went to ceremonies, did a sweat. That is one of the calls to action, number 60, on the formation of clergy. And much, much more could be done. The bishops came out with a statement yesterday in which they said, we've got to be doing more of this. So I don't know if they did this at St. Peter's with the seminarians or the students here. How do we get to engage, not just become more aware of the history of treaties and all sorts of the past system and everything else, but do we actually know Indigenous people? Have we listened to their stories, and how have those stories changed us? Have we really been transformed by friendship? Another project that I was very interested in too is this network here, Jesuit Worldwide Learning. But there are many other groups that do this. This is, they set up, there are 100 million refugees and migrants in the world today. That's a huge statistic. That's more than twice the population of this country. And so what these Jesuit universities have done is put tents in refugee camps around the world. And so does anybody know the average length of stay in a refugee camp? Well, Alison, I know you know this answer. I thought maybe 4 or 5 years. It's up around 13 or 14. And so they figure during that time, you could do at least one university degree. And so these are courses online that you can take in the refugee camps. And when you come out of the camp, you have a degree from a US Jesuit school. Very interesting project. It's quite a great network to be part of. So we talk about listening to the self, listening to others. And I guess the third part of listening that I think is going to really, that's really important in the Catholic tradition, but in other traditions as well, is listening to the other, capital O. In other words, openness to the transcendent. Now, when I used to go with Noel Starblanket, he would always open with a prayer. He was the elder at the University of Regina, a secular institution. And he would always say, I'm going to open with a prayer, and I'm going to pray in my way, and invite you to pray in a way that you're used to. He also would say, do this in the Catholic school board and in the public school board. And he told me one time in the public school board, somebody stopped and said, oh no, Elder Starblanket, this is a public school. We don't have prayer in public school. We just invited you here to talk about your culture. And his answer to that was, I'm Indigenous. I can't separate my spirituality from my culture. So that's kind of a very Western way of looking at it, to say, we will accept your culture here, but we won't accept your faith. So what I think a real richness of the Catholic intellectual tradition is we create a space where we can talk about spirituality and faith, not in a way to convert somebody or to win an argument, but to create an open space where that conversation can occur. And I was always struck at Campion that every year we'd get more and more Muslim students coming in. And they know it was a Catholic liberal arts college, like King's, but one that's inclusive of everybody, where the conversation about faith and spirituality, which is important to most of humanity, where that conversation can occur? Can we create those safe spaces so that people can talk about something that's so meaningful to them? When I talk to my students, they usually tell me they're spiritual but not religious. And that's a very interesting thing that I'm going to talk with the professor about that later. What does that mean? And I ask the students, what's the difference between spirituality and religion? And usually they'll say, well, religion's all those rules and it's patriarchy and it's, I'm not into that. Whereas spirituality is my search for meaning. And I think that goes back to what Taylor said about authenticity. There's a search for authenticity now on the part of many people. Do we have safe spaces where people can engage in that search? For John Henry Newman and his idea of the university, he talks about the danger of the compartmentalization of knowledge. He wasn't against specialties, but he said there were these meta disciplines, and he named two, philosophy and theology. That as we specialize, the role of the university is not to create specialists, he would say, but as you're getting that specialization, to have areas like philosophy and theology that enable you to put that specialty into a bigger whole. And that's where he saw the role of theology in the university, that a university cannot call itself a university if it doesn't teach theology and especially philosophy, because it's these subjects that help us put everything else into a coherent whole. So listening to God, listening to the Spirit in a secular age, I think Taylor's right. I think that there is searching going on. But again, can we create those spaces where that searching can occur? If we take, I'll just go to this last slide here. It creates a basis for interfaith dialogue. If we can create these spaces where people can share about their experience of the other, their experience of the transcendent, without fear of being judged, but rather a way of listening to each other, then we're going a long way towards understanding people of other faiths and backgrounds, which is going to be essential as we move forward in the world today. To go back to the humanist quote, I am human and nothing human can be foreign to me. It seems to me the spiritual is a fundamental part of being human. And as universities that purvey universal knowledge, we have to create a space where that can occur. One without judgment or sense of superiority. Another way of opening ourselves to the transcendent is greater respect for creation. And again, we can think of what's going on in Indigenous education, on living with the land, land-based learning. When I talk with Indigenous educators, a lot of what I'm saying is common sense. In other words, they have elders as a fundamental part of their education. They have ceremony as a fundamental part of their education. And it's interesting in the country at the very time where Indigenous youth are rediscovering their spiritual roots, their non-Indigenous youth, well, we could talk about that spiritual search. Where is it? We continue to come back to Charles Taylor. Is this all there is? Or is there something more? We know that we talked about my colleague, Father John McCarthy, a Jesuit who works on ecology and the whole concept of integral ecology that's expressed in Laudato Si, Pope Francis' document on ecology. What is integral ecology? He looks at the Amazon as an example, but John McCarthy is saying, well, we've forgotten the other lung of our planet, which is the boreal forest, just to the north of us. Integral ecology means bringing together the interests of ecology, development, economy, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. That's integral. And how can we do that in the boreal context? He thinks that the Pope or bishops should come out with a letter on integral ecology in the boreal context, just like they came out with a letter, Querida Amazonia, on integral ecology in the Amazon. So that is the other aspect of the transcendent. So just to wrap up, how do we listen to the still small voice in the university context? I think it's essential. I've talked about those three levels of listening to what's going on within the self, of cultivating that formation of the person, holistic formation, mind, body, spirit, openness to the other, learning from the other, listening to the other. What does the other have to teach me? And of course, listening to the transcendent, being open to the transcendent. And it strikes me that we've become incredibly reductionist in our universities, where we don't recognize the depths. And I think Adolfo Nicholas is right. In the globalization of superficiality, we owe it to our students to provide an education based on depth. Depth of who they are as a person, depth of who they're called to be within a community as leaders who are going to make change, and depth of the human experience, which includes our ties to creation and the creator, however you perceive the creator to be. And as I reflect on it, well, you've probably all seen the famous quote by the Australian Aboriginal activist Lilla Watson, who said this: if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's walk together. And that's what the Indigenous in Saskatchewan taught me. They have the solutions to their problems, to their challenges. And it's about walking together as equals, listening to each other. And that's where we find true reconciliation, liberation. So to create that environment, to cultivate stillness, not easy in a very busy, distracted world. To open our heart to others, to what they have to teach us. To practice active listening in a culture that values talking more than listening. That's Western culture, especially. To commit to dialogue, to get out of our sound echo chambers and to listen to someone whose views are not yours. To collaborate for justice, to be a bridge, not a messiah, and to let the healing happen. I think if we can do those things, we'll go a long way to showing not that Catholic higher education is awkward or outdated or redundant, but that type of holistic education is valuable and necessary now more than ever before. Thank you very much.
All right, I have only one mic, so I'm going to bring this mic around for the Q&A session, and I have to ask, I guess you're stuck here with this mic here, okay? So just logistic-wise, so anyone who would like to ask a question, just let me know. We've got time. We're scheduled till 8:30, so we've got a good 25 minutes. So what brave soul has formulated a question? I will bring you the mic.
No, it's a huge topic.
Yeah, where to start? So everyone looks down. Okay, probably.
What do you think Chat GPT is going to do to the university?
Who's that?
Sorry?
Who?
The AI technology where they can write papers.
Well, I'm waiting to receive my first one. I talked to an expert yesterday in AI, and he's very he's saying like the advances in AI are just going to grow exponentially. And he was predicting that within the next 5 years we'll have a fully AI made film, written by AI, directed and acted all by AI. So that's going to be something to watch. Well, I mean, it's hard to talk about formation of the person when we're talking about AI. You know, all the teachers in the room, I'm sure, are shaking their heads saying, we'd like to read essays written by human beings, if possible. Are there uses of AI that are conducive to what I'm talking about tonight? I mean, that's something that could be explored, right? I think I'm a bit like Taylor in the sense that we can't reject modernity. We have to deal with the things in modernity that are going to be affirming of human life and values. But at the same time, we also have to, and this is coming from my AI expert friend, we have to be very cautious of those things that are going to undermine human agency and increase in the injustice we see in the world. So I'm not an expert in AI. I'm fascinated by it. I've read some of those essays, and some of them seem pretty good, actually. So it's going to be very hard to tell the true ones from the the AI produced ones. But I don't know. Maybe you've dealt with it already, but it's going to become more important as time goes on, for sure. But going back to my AI friend, expert friend, he's saying we're going so headlong into it that he himself says among his colleagues, they're not really thinking too much about the moral implications of where these things could go. And maybe it's time that we should. He said the experiment the last 10 years has been social media. It's been no rules, Wild West. And I think now 10 years later, we're beginning to see the impact that's had on people in terms of mental health, and that maybe these things should be regulated in some way. And he said the next decade, the experiment there that we have to really pay attention to is AI. So that's an interesting response from an AI expert, not me.
Father John, thank you so much. I have a question about liberal arts. I, like many of my colleagues in the room, I think I could speak for them when I say that we're on a mission to, I guess, demonstrate to the public the relevance and the impact of the liberal arts. That's certainly what gets me out of bed in the morning and kind of what keeps me up at night.
I'm sure.
What's your advice for us as a liberal art university, with Catholic tradition? How do we go out, or how would you recommend that we go out into the wilds and explain why this is a good investment for students when so much of commentary by the provincial government, federal government is all around STEM? How can we really demonstrate to the public how critical a liberal arts education is?
Well, it's a question that got me out of bed in the morning in Regina and kept me up at night too. One thing we did at Campion and other places is we showcased our alumni. People who have liberal arts degrees. Well, I guess at McGill, we used to tease the engineers. We used to say, well, you guys can build the bombs, but it's the artsies who get to use them. But that's not a good example. But what I mean by that is going back to Newman's point about the compartmentalization of knowledge and specialization. Yes, we need specialists. If I'm going to have brain surgery, I'd prefer to have a specialist than a generalist do that. But I think for those of you in the liberal arts, I'm not sure if our students are in the liberal arts or many of you have studied it, I always tell students, get a well-rounded education first, including exposure to the marginalized, including leadership opportunities, because it's those things that will help you when you join an organization. If you look at who's leading most organizations, it's usually not the specialists. It's usually some people who have some sort of generalist education who are able to deal with a wide variety of people. I know my colleague Rob is in the room here, and I remember when I was at Campion, the president was a historian, the dean was a historian, and several other ministers were historians. So I have a thesis I'd like to write someday on why historians wind up in administration. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they have nothing better to do, but something about the liberal arts in my own field is history, where we're looking at motivation. I once had students actually ask me to give them the correct answer for the exam on the essay on the history question, so they could write the right answer. I had to tell them that's not how it works. You have to make an argument. You have to argue a point. These, in the classical tradition, they were called disputatios. You had to get up and you had to argue a point opposite of what you actually believed. Now, I think that would be a good thing to do, to understand other ways of presenting things. I wish we did more of that in our society. These are skills, David, I think, that help people rise to the top, that help people realize their leadership capabilities. And that's why we showcased our alumni who are leaders. Again, I don't mean to go on and on about the Jesuits. It's true of other traditions too in Catholic, but it always strikes me the leadership potential of people who have had that education, who then go on and specialize. But that generalist training has enabled them to deal with a wide variety of people, to know thyself, and to become those active, engaged citizens and servant leaders. I missed the ACCU in Washington, D.C. this week, the meeting of Catholic colleges and universities of the U.S. and Canada and other countries. But apparently there was a very interesting talk on social mobility. And I didn't talk about that in my talk, but how universities, well, I mentioned it, how universities have always been a form of social mobility. And for people who come from backgrounds where they're the only person, the first person in their family to go to university, whether they were immigrants 50 years ago, or indigenous, or migrants, or refugees in those refugee camps that I mentioned. The statistic that this fellow gave was the Catholic colleges, I wish I had it in front of me, the data, but it was way above the percentage of students who are there for the first time at university. Now, I don't know why that is. Is that because of the faith communities? They're immigrants from a Catholic country, and somehow they wind up in a Catholic university. But that is very important because that is social mobility in action. And I think that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, knowing that education is really, for me, the best way to change society. It may not be as fast as politics. When I was younger, I wanted to go into politics. Thank God I didn't. But it strikes me through education is the way to learn about the world, to think critically of the world, and to equip yourself with the tools you need to go out there and make a difference. I believe the liberal arts do that. How do you convince government funders of that when they're funding STEM? I think we have to be creative. I think we need to adapt. I think we have to reach out to the STEM areas and specializations to share some of this with them. I'm not saying that we have to, a liberal arts college is only for the liberal arts. I think that it can be there at the service of the wider university. And that seems to be where some things are going. I think the liberal arts have a future, a bright future. There are examples, especially in the US, of small liberal arts colleges that are doing well. But oftentimes it's those colleges that have a strong sense of identity and mission. Because as I said earlier in my comments, if that's not front and center, then I think the default is you become a business, and instead of teaching students, you're counting bums and seats. And that's a very different view of higher education than what I'm trying to present this evening. We're going to give you a mic there, Alison, so they can hear you online. Yeah, just so for people online.
Okay. Hello, Zoomers.
Yeah.
Thank you, because that was a great talk, and I enjoyed so much about it. And I think, as I just said, we are really lucky. We have great students. I think we have a tremendously talented faculty here. We get students out into the world. But I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on what you were just mentioning about mission and what role that plays within the context of the university, and how do you speak to mission to potential students and to the communities around you to be relevant at a time where there are so many who are distracted by some of the more negative narratives they get. Everything from a guidance counselor who may say to you, "You're crazy to go study the liberal arts, you'll never get a job," or others who are really troubled by a lot of the historical involvement of churches with things like residential schoolings and colonization. How do you see mission operating?
Mission, as I said earlier, mission's essential, especially for a small college, because the question is always going to be, what's your value added? That's a question that I got when I was in Regina, and especially at Laurentian. A question that came up all the time: what do you add to the Federation? Because if you can't answer that question, then why do you exist? If you can't, as a community, say what makes you different, then what's the point in continuing as a federated college? I believe in the federated colleges. I believe in federalism. I think federalism, as we see in Canada, well, it's very frustrating. You can pull out your hair, but of all the systems I've seen, it's the best way of ensuring diversity within diversity within a larger structure. And that's the history of federations, is that in the Canadian case, built on kind of the Oxbridge model, but Canadianized, these were mostly denominational schools, some of which have kept the denominational affiliation, many of them have not. And that's up to them, that's fine. But if you jettison it, what do you replace it with? Because it's going to be, as I said earlier, it's going to be harder to distinguish yourself from the main university. So what a lot of schools, including Jesuit schools, is you emphasize the values. What are your values? Men and women for others. You don't have to be Catholic to be a person for others. Social justice. There are values. I think what you need to do on that is you remain true to your Catholic roots, let's say, but you make sure that you're open to everybody. And you unite people with values that everyone can get behind. And certainly at Campion, our Muslim students, our Protestant students, our Jewish students, our even agnostic students liked the focus on care of the person. They liked the focus on social justice. They liked the focus on community, that they weren't just a number, they were actually a name. They'd come in and see an advisor who knew them by name and could not only advise them on which courses to take and who are the good professors, but wind up talking about life and what you might want to, about your vocation, what you might be doing in life. I think we sell our students short when we just sell them a career. Careers, of course, are important, but I think people want to know what their vocation is in life. What are you called to do? Again, it goes along with a career, but I think it's something a little deeper. Why are you here on earth? What's your purpose? That's something that we can help everybody figure out. So I think if you lose the mission and identity, what I've seen in the sector, and I certainly saw this up in Sudbury, is the default is it becomes a business. And what was a beautiful career as a teacher, a vocation to be an educator, can become just a job without the same level of satisfaction or community engagement. Not saying that happens in every case, but that there's a danger of that. And the Laurentian case is tragic, I think, because I don't think it had to go that way. Rather than encourage the diversity that is a federation, that was not recognized or valued, and the community is much poorer for it, I think. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, the mission identity, again, I mean, this is a Catholic context, but the mission could be, like, it doesn't have to be Catholic, it could be some other mission, like other denomination, or Indigenous schools have a clear mission and identity, very clear. And I think we should look at them and see what we have to learn. Because as I said, they are not confused at all about the role of the university. They know the role of the university is to transform the person and transform the society. And that's something that we've lost and that we have to regain in most of the Western post-secondary sector.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Dylan. And hey, I've been listening to the talk. It's very nice. Like, I related to a lot of things you said, and really good in a way where I just finished my college and I'm like getting to work and stuff. My main question is like, not question. What I want to ask you about is when you talk about belief system, like, when you're talking about, like, there are a lot of things in my mind right now. The things you said about like creating a dialogue that and education when like is the way to change things. I feel like that's the way, like, to go. That's like top notch. And as a person coming from India, to come here to a new country to search, like, a purpose of like what I'm doing in this world. in a place where I've like been constricted by social and like societal like pressures and differences. And it's kind of like finding your place. So anyway, like I kind of like got interested in the Catholic kind of way because of the dialogue you mentioned. There's an opportunity here to have a dialogue, to like talk about it. And that's when I'm kind of comfortable in this. And the question I want to actually ask is like, you talked about like people trying to find religious, like no spirituality and stuff like that. And to get the motivation to do what they want to do. Money is kind of like the people get like kind of distracted by money, like everything's going along with money. So I want to ask you, like, how do you see that? Like, how does that? Because you can just see money as its own like spiritual, like a belief system or something. Because people kind of like get up every day in their life to like go about money. Like at the end of the day, it's all about money. That kind of like mindset, like even though you talk about like, you know, people go like, university kind of like go about like trying to help people find their way to be a good person. But and like finally, if they lose the spirit, they go back to a business model at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
So why does it happen? Like, why are we going at money?
Well, we need money. Yeah. I think we have so bought into what Taylor talks about instrumentality of university education that it might actually work against universities. If we see university, I mean, what is the purpose of university? If we see the university as a purveyor of knowledge, well, we've got the internet. We don't need a university for that. At one point in history, we saw universities as agents of social change. Are they still agents of social change? I was talking to a university administrator the other day who, a former ambassador actually, who was talking to university administrators who was not going to issue any statements against human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia or China. So we used to think of universities as agents of social change, but now are they still that? So I guess what is the role of university? Is it job training? Well, we've got great community colleges to do that. This is why I say university is facing an identity crisis. And that's fine. It has to happen because the forces of modernity are so strong. But I actually see an opportunity for the small liberal arts colleges to show a way forward. They're small and nimble and can change and do this. Of course, people want, well, you talk about money. I am struck by generational differences, and I don't know if the younger people in the room tonight agree with this or not. If not, please nab me after the talk and say, you're totally wrong. You got us all wrong. But the students that I talk to, they're not necessarily going for the highest paying jobs. The students that I talk to are looking for fulfillment as well. That's an important factor. They don't want to get necessarily stuck in a job that earns a lot of money, but where they're going to be miserable. So going back to that question, is this all there is? Of course, you need a career where you're able to provide for your families. That's very important. But again, how do you figure out what your purpose is in life? That's a little bit deeper than just the job, but it includes the job, if you know what I mean. Does that answer your question? No? I think it's with us for some time to come. But, you know, maybe not cash. We don't need that anymore. It's all going to be plastic. Or Bitcoin. No. No, I mean, I'm not sure I totally get your question. Oh, well, now that's a very different question. Who was I talking to the other day, and they're telling me my brother is in Turin, Italy this year with his children, and they're going to a French school. The tuition is 3,000 euros a year. The same French school in Toronto is 20,000. My friends in France, a university in France, is a fraction of what it costs here, which is a fraction of what they pay south of the border. If you look at some Canadian schools now, especially law schools, business schools, even some of our schools, God forbid, at U of T of all places, they're not cheap. So I think we have to look at our values as a society, going back to the common good. I know we need to revamp the whole healthcare sector, but it seems to me the priorities seem to be mixed up. If nurses get paid what they do for the jobs they do, and I mean, I don't want to put one job above another, but how we pay people in a society says how much we think they're worth. And if, without singling out professions, as a Jesuit, I don't make it. Well, I make something, but I don't keep it. So money is a little different for me. But I think as a society, we really have to look at how we're compensating people to make sure it reflects that the value that they bring to our society. I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. And that's where the social justice, we have to look at this and say, you know, it's nice to say you're heroes to people in the healthcare sector, to those nurses who have been working around the clock and doctors all during the pandemic. But they strike me as somewhat empty when we don't actually compensate them for the work that they're doing. And that's just one example. But I would put teachers in the same category. I think teachers are incredibly important. Teachers, educators, you are planting a seed in people that is going to last for life. It's an incredibly important profession. And I love it. I don't think I'd rather be doing anything else. But do we compensate them for the work they do? And not just the full-time professors, but also sessionals and the work that they do. A lot of departments rely increasingly on them. So there are some very important justice issues that we have to face in the academy. And I know this comes up in the Jesuit schools too, saying it's nice to promote social justice, but do we promote justice within our own institution? That's something to look at too. Yeah. Yeah.
When I went to university, I was very fortunate to have a very bright friend as a classmate, and he ended up being a professor of chemical engineering at McGill. Very, very good guy. He just recently retired, and I don't think it was
You want to
perfect.
repeat that for the people at home?
So he said to me, if you love your students, they will love you back.
I think that's a good way to end this evening, because that's the danger, I think, of the transactional approach to education. If we are just giving degrees to students because they paid for them, there's not much love in that equation. It's transactional. And it seems that we're missing the core of what it means to be in education, which is transformation of the person to go out and transform society. That's what I've been talking about tonight. To do that requires a commitment. It requires a lot of love. I agree. The professors have to love the students. Love in the sense of wanting the best for them, of being dedicated to them, of forging that relationship with them, so that the students not only learn in their classrooms, but are changed and will remember that professor for the rest of their lives. And we've all had professors and teachers who've had that lifelong impact on us. I wouldn't be up here tonight if it weren't for those teachers. And one of the biggest pleasures for me as an educator is when the students come back and tell me what they've done with their lives. They ask for reference letters and they get into law school or they get into wherever they're going. And of course, as a Jesuit, they come back and ask me to do their weddings and baptize their kids, which is nice too. I do that at no extra charge. So it is vocation is about love. And I think we have to revive the language of vocation in the academy so that we offer our students something more fulfilling than what is offered in the standard kind of business of higher education that we seem to be embarking upon. So I guess that's the message that I have for you tonight. And it's wonderful to be here with you. And I look forward to continuing this after we're finished. So thanks so much for your attention this evening.